trip I took recently with my family, where we went from Spain to Singapore using only trains, and then extended the trip by flying to Japan, traveled down Japan using trains again, and then took a ferry to Korea before flying back home after 80 days. So I wanted to make this video partly as a nice memory for myself and my family, and partly to tell others about how we managed a trip like this and share some important things to know if you're planning something similar. The whole trip itself took about 1 month to plan, and it was basically my dad who did the entire planning. Before any extra bookings, my dad started by drawing a rough line on a map of how we wanted to go. From that, we picked out the cities that we wanted to visit. We tried to skip the cities or countries that we'd already been to, but some places were unavoidable unless we wanted to take a much longer route. It was my dad's idea to do the whole trip using only trains, so that's what we limited ourselves to. And when that wasn't possible or it was just fully booked, we opted to take a bus. Initially, even though technically the whole trip was planned, we only had the European part of the trip fully booked. For the other countries, we were booking and planning along the way on trains or in hotels when we had time. And for Japan and Korea, we actually didn't book anything until we were in Singapore. If you're planning a train trip like this, you need to know about the Man in Seat 61. It's a blog with just so much information about train travel anywhere in the world, and that's where we got most of our information from. The blog itself was actually made years ago, but it is updated, so everything is pretty much up to date. Another great source for the information are the Interrail Facebook groups, which are super useful whenever we just had questions or we're just unsure about some things in Europe. For booking the trains, we mostly use the national rail websites of the countries we were traveling to, and we either found these through a quick Google search or just from the links from the Man in Seat 61. Now, there are a lot of ways to plan a trip like this, and it just really depends on how you prefer to do things. But I think whatever you do, it's really important to stay organized because it can get really messy really quickly. Now, we were quite lucky when it came to visa requirements, so we basically did not need any visas except for Russia and China. The Russian visa process was really simple. It was just an online form, and I got the visa in my email within 2 days. But the Chinese visa was the problem. So they required me to either travel in a group of at least 5 people or have a stamped invitation letter from their government travel office, which was basically impossible to get. So I couldn't go to China. And instead, while my parents continued throughout China, I went to New Zealand to visit my friends since that's where I grew up. So that's the only difference in my trip, and also the reason why in this video I won't be talking about China as much. Now I'll talk a little bit about the things we did before we actually left. The first thing obviously was health insurance. We got a travel insurance for 3 months to cover us throughout the entire trip. Russia was a little bit tricky, so we made sure to get a policy that explicitly covered us while we were there. The second thing is a Revolut card. So we ordered a Revolut card about 2 weeks before leaving, and it turned out to be incredibly useful for converting money. If you get the Meadow plan, which for me was the same as the premium plan, you can withdraw as much cash as you want in ATMs for free and exchange at really great rates. The only hiccup was in Thailand when there was a flat fee of about 6 euros for any ATM withdrawal. Another common question we got was how and what did we pack? So we knew it wouldn't be too cold during our trip as it was between August and October, but we packed for almost any weather situation. This included rain jackets, jeans, puffy vests, summer dresses, shorts, and plenty of t-shirts and tops. We used medium-sized luggages, me and my mom, and my dad carried a large backpack. For shoes, I bought 2 pairs of sneakers, 2 flip-flops, and 1 pair of black sandals. Looking back, we definitely could have packed a lot lighter, but I also wanted to have some nice outfits, and I took a bit of everything. So we made sure to bring things to keep us busy during the travel days. We kept our Netflix and Amazon subscriptions until after Russia, and then canceled them since they didn't work in many of the countries we visited after Russia. I bought crochet hooks and yarn for the long train rides, while my parents packed a lot of books. So from here forward, I will just be mentioning each location that we went to, and I will be starting with the Europe part of the trip up until Russia. I'll be giving a little bit about what we liked, what we didn't like, as well as just some little information that's good to know. So first up is Montpellier. So we chose Montpellier as a midway stop on our way to Geneva. Otherwise, the travel time in 1 day just would have been too much. Originally, we booked a train from Valencia to Barcelona and then another train from Barcelona to Montpellier. However, the night we were due to leave, at around 2 a.m., we get an email saying that our train from Valencia to Barcelona had been cancelled. So with everything else sold out, we had to book a Flixbus instead. Montpellier is a lovely city, but it is quite small, so I wouldn't recommend spending more than 2 days there, as there just isn't much to do. That said, it is a very charming and friendly city. We didn't do anything specific when we were there, but just walking around the city was very fun and beautiful because it was summer and it was just quite crowded and lively. We arrived at around 4 p.m. and left the next morning at 9 a.m., so it was just a quick, nice little stopover. So number 2 is Geneva. So we went to Geneva via train, transferring from Grenoble, and arrived in the city center at about 2 p.m. The cool thing here is that Geneva offers free public transport to tourists if you stay in hotels, and I think Airbnbs as well. You just have to complete a form sent to you by your accommodation, and you get a card online in your email, which you can show on any public transport you use. The highlight of Geneva for me had to be the CERN lab. It was genuinely one of the best parts of the trip. We took the tram from the city to CERN, which takes a little bit of time since it's slightly outside of the city center. The tickets are a little bit tricky to get. You can access the exhibition tickets anytime, so that won't be an issue, but you'll definitely want to see the synchrocyclotron, which is the first particle accelerator at CERN, and also the Atlas Room. Another top attraction in Geneva is the United Nations. I think they offer tours inside, but we chose not to go in and just admired it from the outside instead. Another famous one is obviously the water jet, which blasts water up to 140 meters in height. It was first built in 1886 as a safety valve for an hydraulic network, but now it stands as a symbol of the city. You can even walk right up to it using a little walkway that they made. Something I didn't expect in Geneva was how many amazing beaches they had along the lake. Unfortunately, we only discovered them on our very last day, so we didn't get to swim. But if you're visiting during the summer, I highly recommend going in for a dip. The third is Salzburg. So we took the train here with a stopover at Zurich and then Munich. The train from Zurich was delayed, and so we had about 6 minutes to make it onto the next train in Munich, and of course the train that we had to take was on the opposite side of the train station. And other than that, the view was just so beautiful from the train since it passes so close to the Alps. The funny thing about Salzburg was that we accidentally booked a hotel that was like a student accommodation about a 20-minute walk from the city center of Salzburg. I think they convert student accommodation into hotels for tourists for the summer period. But overall, it was just very clean and nice. The number one thing you have to see here would be the Hohensalzburg Fortress. You can go up with a cable car and enjoy the views from there, but also walking inside the fortress is very nice and beautiful. Another place to visit would be the Mirbach Gardens, which is famous from the Sound of Music. Lastly, the Old Town is very nice to walk through, and there are a lot of boutique shops throughout, especially a lot of Christmas decoration shops, which are really, really cute. In the Old Town, you can also find Mozart's birthhouse, which is open for tourists. We personally didn't go inside because it was just so crowded and it didn't feel worth it to us, but there is that option. When you're there, you should also try a schnitzel and a Salzburg Nocco, which is a souffle-like fluffy pancake dish. So fourth up is Prague. So we took a train here via Linz. So Prague seems like a very nice city, but we went there in the middle of August and there were just so many tourists, so we didn't really get to enjoy the city at all. All of the tourist attractions were full of people, even the cafes and restaurants were all fully booked, and it was impossible to even cross the bridges because of just how many people there were. For that reason, I would definitely advise to go at another time where there are less tourists. Of course, we still had a nice couple of days there. We walked around the city center and saw the major landmarks. We tried the chimney cake, which is so famous, which everyone recommended us to try. But for us, we just didn't like it because it was just so sweet. So because my parents' train was fully booked, I ended up staying an extra day while they went on to Krakow. So I went to Lenin Wall, which was really nice, but again, it was just so crowded. On the way there, I also passed through the cable car entrance, and even if it was the morning, the line was going all the way down to the street, which was insane. Sadly, I have nothing much else to add because of what I just said before, that there were just so many tourists in the end, and it was just so frustrating trying to go around the city. So number 5 is Krakow. So as I mentioned before, there was a bit of a problem of me getting to Krakow as all the trains from Prague to Krakow were sold out weeks in advance. So if you're planning a trip like this in the summer, I would definitely recommend to book at least 1.5 months in advance to avoid my problem. My parents were able to get the tickets since they booked before, but I had to wait until the afternoon and change 2 trains to get to Krakow, so I had 1 day less there. What I can add here, which I thought to be was a very valuable experience, was visiting Auschwitz. Now, this is one of the things which in hindsight we could have booked in advance, but because we were booking everything at once, we couldn't book all of the activities beforehand, so we took a risk in all of the cities that we went to. For entering Auschwitz, you can't go in alone and you have to go in a group tour, which can either be with the groups Auschwitz does itself in many different languages, or it can be with a third-party website with an outside tour guide. We did read that it's very difficult to get in unless you have pre-booked tickets. However, one person on Facebook groups for tourists in Krakow did write that if you go really early, you're able to grab tickets for the day, so that's what we decided to do. So we went there at about 7 to 8 a.m. and we went in line. It was already long, but after waiting about 2 hours, we were able to get a slot for, I think it was 11:30, so in the end, it wasn't too much of a wait. It's such a big area, which I knew before, but I just didn't realize the size, so you should be prepared to walk a lot. And you should bring water with you because in the summer, not only is it a lot of walking, but it's also very, very warm. It's definitely worth going to and to learn about the history there. So number 6, Warsaw. Warsaw was really nice. It was more of a big city vibe, unlike Krakow, which had a more old city feeling. That being said, I liked both equally. The funny experience we had there was that we booked a hotel a little bit outside of the city center, but it was a good price and it had a good bus connection to the city. So we ended up getting a day ticket for the bus and we took it into the city center and we walked the whole day. And on our way back, we saw a couple of army men here and there, but we didn't think much of it and we just kept walking to our bus stop. So then we started noticing that some roads were actually blocked. And by the time we got to where we were supposed to take our bus, we realized that actually there was no traffic on the road and no buses were passing. We started walking down towards our hotel and we actually ran into another Turkish guy and his friends who told us that apparently that day, which was the 10th and 11th of August, they were doing a trial run for the army day, so they had closed down all the roads and were going to pass their army equipment through the whole night. So essentially we ended up walking all the way to our hotel, which was a little over an hour, but when we were walking we did see how buzzing and lively the riverside was. I highly recommend it if you're looking for more of a party vibe. The whole side of the river, roughly starting from the Centrum Nauki Kopernik downwards, is just people sitting and drinking on the side of the river with music and a lot of little bars there which were packed, and it was just really fun. The old town here was very nice and full of tourists and locals, so if you walk around there's just so many nice cafes which I loved. While you're there you can also try zurek, I hope I pronounced it right, which is a bread that's hollowed out with soup inside. Here you also have to visit the Palace of Culture and Science and go up to the top floor to see the whole city. Although the building itself has a questionable past, they definitely have made it into a very nice area for art and theater. There are also nice cafes underneath where a lot of locals were actually hanging out. Another cool thing Warsaw has to offer was the Money Museum, which I didn't see was very talked about in any of the touristic websites, but I found it to be really fun and different from the other activities we did in other cities. It's free to enter and you can spend about 2 to 3 hours in there easily, and it teaches you about money and how it evolved, but also about how banks and everything else work. There's also a gold bar in there which is 12 kilos that you can try and lift up. So 7th is Vilnius. So it was quite rainy when we arrived. The city itself is beautiful. It has an old town area and a more modern part of the city, which is divided by a river running between them. We personally didn't go to the modern part of the city, but it seemed very big and crowded. So we ended up booking an Airbnb type apartment there, and it was very nice and cozy and super close to the city center. I think if you're coming only for 1 to 2 days, there's no need to use public transport as everything in the old town is just a walking distance away. To be honest, although it was a very nice European city, it was just a bit dead in terms of things to do and touristy things, but definitely it's one of the countries that I wanted to see for a while and I'm glad we went. So number 8, Riga. So we came here by bus because the timing of the train was really odd and it would have taken way too long. But either way, it was a comfortable bus ride. We got the bus tickets for this I think 2 to 3 days beforehand and it was completely fine. When it comes to Riga, its old town is an old UNESCO heritage site, so it has a lot of nice buildings with old beautiful architecture. One of these buildings is actually the tourist center in the old town and it is a very beautiful and definitely must-see building. So number 9, Tallinn. From Riga to Tallinn, we also took a bus again for the same reasoning. So we also took a day trip to Helsinki. We got a ferry from Tallinn, which was pre-booked about 1 to 2 weeks before, and it was able to take us to Helsinki in about 2 hours. The ferry itself is called Tallink, and it is a super modern, huge ferry. You have Starbucks, restaurants, and other cafes inside. You have a huge duty-free store and a bunch of lounging areas where actually people were sleeping in since it was quite early in the morning. There were a lot of tourists, but I assume also a lot of people who work in Helsinki but live in Tallinn use this ferry as well. Helsinki was such a cute, nice city, and it reminded me a lot of Oslo. I loved walking along the water where they also had some food stands where they sold some fish and chips. Around that area is also the old market hall, which they have fish soup. To be honest, the market is definitely worth seeing, but everything inside is quite overpriced for what it is, so the food stalls were actually quite empty, and it was just a lot of people looking around inside. Here, the cathedral was definitely a highlight since there was some sort of rock concert going on with about 100 electric guitar players all playing at the same time. It was such a cool concert to see, and we didn't know it was on, so we accidentally just stumbled into it. So this part of my video will be about Russia. So I'll be talking about how we got into Russia, what we did when we were there, as well as cover the Trans-Siberian train travel. I'll try to give as much details as I can, but it's important to also note that due to the current events, the information I'll provide might just be outdated, and so it's important to do your own research beforehand. Firstly, now I'll cover how we actually crossed into Russia. So at the time that we went, all the roads from Europe were closed for the passage of vehicles. The only border that was open were for pedestrians, and it was through Estonia. So this is where we entered from. We were able to book a bus from Tallinn to St. Petersburg, where one bus takes you from Tallinn to Valga, which is at the border between Russia and Estonia, and it drops you off there where you line up and you go through the Estonian customs and then the Russian customs. And then another bus on the Russian side awaits you until all the passengers of the bus from Estonia have boarded, and it takes you directly to St. Petersburg. We personally use a bus company called Lux Express, but there are other companies providing the same routes. We ended up waiting about 5 hours in line to go through the Estonian customs, as they were taking only 10 people every half an hour. Once we passed that, we walked through the border towards the Russian side on foot. It was about a 5-minute walk, so it wasn't too long. When we got to the other side, we waited about an extra 1 hour for the Russian customs, where they checked our visa, but it was all very fast. We were one of the last ones to board the bus, so after about 30 minutes we were able to get going towards St. Petersburg, and we made it there at around 4 p.m. Again, with the current situation, we had to pay all the hotels in cash as we weren't able to pay online. So something I highly recommend you to do before you go to Russia is to learn the alphabet. Although it's a different language entirely, if you know how to read the alphabet, you can just about make out what a lot of the stuff means. I did Duolingo for a couple of days before we went into Russia, and I found that to be just enough to get by. So first up is St. Petersburg. I think St. Petersburg is one of the most beautiful cities I've ever seen in my life. I would say I liked it just a little bit better than Moscow, just in the sense that there was more to do and a lot more to see. One thing you can't miss when you're in St. Petersburg is to visit the Winter Palace. So it was actually quite funny for us because we were told that we had to book the tickets months in advance because it books out so quickly, and the tickets are normally super expensive because of the current situation and us not being able to use our cards in Russia. And honestly, because we were planning everything in only a month, we couldn't really pre-book anything, so we didn't have the tickets for this. We went to Winter Palace only to check if maybe we can get tickets for another day, and we ended up walking straight in and we got a ticket there, and I think it was only about €5 per person, and we were able to go and walk in right away. Inside, there were still a lot of people, but I think nowhere near as how crowded it would normally be. And everyone inside, for me, looked like they were just Russian tourists. So the Winter Palace is absolutely huge, and it's going to take the whole day to tour the whole thing quickly. There is no way you're going to be able to slowly look at everything in one day because there's just so many exhibitions and so many things to see. What we did was we knew what we were interested in seeing, so we went slower during those sections, but when other rooms came, we just passed those quicker. Even this way, we just about finished everything by closing time. Not only are the exhibitions all super cool, but the building itself is just beautiful, and every single room inside has a different vibe to it. Another thing we're seeing here is the Church of the Savior on Blood, which I really recommend visiting and going inside because I think it's just one of the more unique Orthodox churches in Russia. We coincidentally went in when there was a mass, which was really interesting to see. So if you manage to time it during a mass, you can enter for free. Otherwise, you can buy the tickets at the door. We reserved one day for a boat trip and to visit the Keshinskaya mansion, I hope I said that right, where they converted it into a historical museum, where there is also a remake of Lenin's room there with his desk. After that, we walked through the park and around to where the Svinsky statues are, where we boarded the boat for the boat trip. The boat took us around the Neva River, in front of the Peter and Paul Fortress, down some narrow canals, and then dropped us back off in the same place. Another must-do here is to visit the Fabergé Museum. For those who don't know the story behind it, Carl Fabergé was a jeweler in Russia of French descent, and he was famous for creating imperial Easter eggs for the Tsars. In total, it's believed 50 eggs existed, but only 43 were found to this day, which are displayed here in the Fabergé Museum as well as in the Kremlin Armory. Another super fun thing to do here, which also goes for Moscow, is to see the metro stations. The story I read about them was that when they were building the metro lines, they didn't want these to only be for transportation. However, they wanted it also to represent the city itself. Now, there are other activities, of course, to do in St. Petersburg, but these are just some ones that were a highlight for our trip. So now I'll get into Moscow. So we took a train here from St. Petersburg, and the tickets we got for this on the second day that we were there from the main train station, since again it was just one of these things that we weren't able to purchase online. Of course, here you need to go to the Red Square, which is where everything is. From here you can go into GUM, which is a shopping mall from the 1800s, and it was actually a department store in the Soviet era. Other things to see in or around the Red Square is the Mausoleum of Lenin, the Kremlin, St. Basil's Cathedral, Zarzadya Park, and a little bit further down you will find the Bolshoi Theater. All of them were super interesting, especially entering the Kremlin. We didn't go into the St. Basil's Theater as when we went it was just extremely crowded and it just didn't seem worth it for us. Again, I have to mention the metro stops here as Moscow is known to have the most beautiful metro stations in the world. The one that is interesting here is the Park Pobedi metro station since it is known to be the deepest metro station in the world at approximately 84 meters underground. We also went to the famous Gorky Park for one of the days and we really enjoyed it. It was a nice day out, so there were a lot of activities and cafes inside. So now onto the Trans-Siberian. So I think this is the part where a lot of people want to hear about. If you want to take the whole trip to Moscow to the end, which is Vladivostok, it takes an entirety of 7 days. We personally wanted to get up at Irkutsk so we can cross to Mongolia, so our journey took 4 days. What we didn't know that we found quite interesting is how frequently the train stops. In total, I think there are around 140 stops if you take it the whole way to Vladivostok. What a lot of people also don't know is that you are not served food throughout the entire journey. You have to buy your own food for the entirety of your stay on board. The only food that you do get is a complimentary meal on the first day that you board the train, and that's it. So what you need to buy is essentially all fruits for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks for however long you are on board, including water. On top of these, we also got 3 glass mugs to eat our instant noodles and to drink tea or have some cereal. Mainly ended up getting canned food because actually there's no fridge on board either. So in total, this is what we got for 3 of us. We got 2 packs of plastic plates and forks, 3 glass mugs, 1 vegetable milk. We got 1 pack of cereal, 1 pack of salami, and 1 pack of cheese to make sandwiches. We got 1 pack of big bread, 6 packs of instant soup, 4 to 5 packs of instant mashed potatoes, 1 bottle of juice, a squeezed bottle of jam, 4 cans of canned fish, 3 bottles of 1.5 liter water, and some toilet paper. Now, all this being said, is not actually a huge problem if you do run out of food or you want something, as there's always little kiosks at bigger stations where you can get food and drinks. There was a stop where we stopped for a little over an hour where my parents were actually able to get me Burger King from inside the station because, to be honest, I was so bored of eating the same instant food every single day. So the train itself has 2 compartments, a hostel type compartment, which is basically what it says, is where you sleep in a carriage of about 20-ish people with a curtain as separation, and it is a bit cheaper than what we got. What we got was a 4-bed compartment, which, if I remember correctly, there are about 5 rooms per carriage. Each carriage has 2 sets of bathrooms, one with a fully equipped shower and the other one just with a toilet and a sink. Each carriage also has a hostess whose job is to take care of their carriage. We were so lucky that we got a hostess that spoke a little bit of English, but the hostesses in the other carriages didn't speak any English. From what we saw, we were the only non-Russians on the entire train. The best thing was the cleaning and upkeep of the carriages. They were vacuuming the carriages and the rooms every single day, and the toilets were kept very, very clean, and the hostess was always so helpful whenever we needed something. An important thing for me is also the fact that there's no Wi-Fi on board, which we imagined before boarding, but also the cell phones don't have any cell service unless you stop at one of the major stops, and even then you only get about 1 bar of cell service. So practically you're without any means of communication for about 4 days. That's why I really recommend that you take your laptop or iPad and you just download as many movies and TV shows as you can. Take a book, or we took our knitting needles and yarn to keep us occupied. Otherwise there's really nothing else to do on board. The people in the other compartments were all chatting to each other all day, but because we didn't speak Russian, it was just really hard to communicate with everyone, especially without Google Translate. So we shared our compartment with a Russian lady that did not speak any English, so it was definitely an interesting experience to try and communicate with her throughout the day, especially without Google Translate. But she was very nice and she actually taught us a lot of cool things about Russia. All in all, it was definitely an experience, but I would never go on another train for so long without stopping in between, because 4 days was just honestly a really long time to be on a train, and by the 4th day I was just really ready to get off. I think a better idea would be just to visit the cities in the middle of Russia and divide the time on the train. Also, you would think that there's something to see throughout Russia in the middle as you're passing by with the train, but honestly there was basically nothing. It was just some land and trees. So Irkutsk was where we actually got off the Trans-Siberian train. We were only there overnight because my visa was actually about to expire in 4 days and we didn't want to risk being in Russia until the last day of my visa, just in case something went wrong and we needed the extra days. But in hindsight, we could have stayed 2 days in Irkutsk. It is a very small town, but it is famous for its famous Lake Baikal. We went past it and the view was just so beautiful and so nice. I really don't have anything else to sadly add about Irkutsk. However, it is a small town and is one of the places where nobody speaks English and it's hard to communicate with everyone, so that's something to keep in mind. So we went to Mongolia using a sleeper train from Irkutsk the following morning. It was very similar to the Trans-Siberian train, except a little bit more basic. So for example, there was hot water, but it was for a fee. There were no showers and there was only a small toilet. The interesting and useful thing to know about this train is when you pass the border, a Mongolian man gets on the train with a huge chunk of money and he basically exchanges your rubles for Mongolian tugrit. Mongolia was definitely an experience. We were so lucky here to have family friends who were very kind and took us sightseeing around. What was crazy about Ulaanbaatar is that we were headed to see the Genghis Khan statue, and about a 15-minute drive from the city center heading towards the statue, the scenery changes abruptly from city center to just empty land, and the whole drive following that is basically just a single road with empty land and just some horses around. I think in this day and age, I've never seen such a stretch of empty land in my entire life, so it was definitely an interesting thing to see. Honestly, there isn't much to do here other than the Genghis Khan statue, but I say Mongolia is definitely worth to visit just to see those fields. I know some people also do some off-road activities and stay in the traditional Mongolian tents, which would also definitely be a cool activity to do. So from here, I personally flew to Auckland because, as I mentioned before, I was not able to get a visa into China like my parents. I was already wanting to go to New Zealand at the end of this trip, so instead of doing that, I just went in the time that my parents would be in China, and we decided that I would catch up with them in Laos. I won't add too much here as I didn't go as a tourist, and honestly I had a great time there, just winding down, catching up with my friends that I hadn't seen in years, and just enjoying my time there. However, I definitely recommend NZ to anyone who hasn't been before, especially people who like nature and hiking and trekking, as there's just so many nature activities to do there. I will skip directly from here to Laos as I don't want to comment on China since I didn't personally go. The only thing that I will mention is that if you are traveling to China, to make sure you download and activate WeChat, especially in the paying part, because without it, you're basically unable to do anything in China. So next up is Vientiane. So I knew more or less what I was expecting because it borders Vietnam and I visited Vietnam previously. However, when we went there, sadly Laos did experience a flood about 2 days before we were there. So the city was just still recovering from that. A lot of the things like the Buddha Park and the installations next to Mekong River were underwater, so they were trying to clear those when we were there. I think in Vientiane, it is important to stay in the city center because everything is around that area, but getting around is also quite easy with the tuk-tuks. I highly recommend downloading the app called Kokok Move for ordering a tuk-tuk because it's super fast and super cheap. One thing to look out for in Laos is the food. I would avoid eating things like salad or uncooked things as there is the possibility of getting sick. A highlight in Vientiane was visiting the Textile Museum. There's a beautiful old wooden building where they make fabric, and the museum basically takes you through how the fabric is made and dyed. They actually still produce fabric there, and they have their own stores, so you can see the woman weaving fabric. You can also try your hand at making fabric with the old tools that they have been using for many years. It was a very interactive place, and I think it would be perfect for kids as well as adults. So next up is Bangkok. So we again took a sleeper train here from Vientiane. So this was definitely a more eventful train travel than the others. First of all, there are 2 train stations in Vientiane and they're very outside of the city center, about a 40-minute drive away, and the other one being 1 hour drive away. So we accidentally ended up going to the wrong train station, and after thinking that we would be stranded there, we convinced a guy to take us to our actual train station, which was about a 23-minute drive away, and our train was taking off from there in 25 minutes. So he actually ended up getting us there with 1 minute to spare, and we ended up making it onto the train. The first train you go on takes you past the border of Laos, and then you have to wait there for about an hour in a train station until you get picked up by the other train, which then takes you to Bangkok. On the second train, we again had to share a compartment with another person. So this time it was a Japanese guy who had another friend in another compartment. So we started chatting to them, and eventually we all really got along and we exchanged information, and we actually ended up meeting them in Tokyo. So from this point forward, we were actually very lucky that we had friends in each country that we were able to either stay with or meet up with, and it was just so nice to have that opportunity. Also, we actually have been to all of the countries from here until Singapore previously, but we basically had to pass them since it's just such a small strip of land until Singapore that you basically have no other choice. Also, it was just nice to visit them after such a long time of not being back. I will say getting around in Bangkok is definitely very easy with or without public transport. We mostly walked places or we took the SkyTrain to get to other places. Otherwise, taxis are also quite cheap. We had already visited a lot of the touristic places on our last trip, but this time we went to Chatuchak markets again since last time we weren't able to tour it so freely since it was just really hot. One thing we went to here this time that we hadn't gone to previously was Wat Pho. So it is a temple and home to the reclining Buddha. The Buddha itself was definitely very cool, but the whole temple is just a work of art. It has tower-like structures called chedis, and they're all decorated differently with a lot of color and different stones. So it was just a little bit outside of the city center, but definitely worth a visit. So the next one is Kuala Lumpur. So this was actually the last time we took a sleeper train. I will say, I think out of all the sleeper trains, this was definitely one of the most chaotic ones that we've been on, and we just didn't get any sleep. Because at every stop there are food sellers that come on board and they just scream what they're selling, and this just went on throughout the night. Here in KL, we actually stayed with one of my dad's friends and his family. We have been to KL a couple of times before as well, so it was just nice to see the city again. The week we had actually gone was the week that Petronas Mercedes AMG was celebrating their 30th anniversary, so the city was buzzing with Formula 1 activities, and the drivers were doing some meet and greets, but we personally didn't get to see it in time. Of course, here we went to Petronas Towers, and we just toured a little bit of the city, but honestly, it was just insanely hot, and we didn't feel like doing anything, because as soon as you stepped outside, you were just a pool of sweat. We did end up visiting the Batu Caves one of the days, which we didn't climb the stairs, we just saw from the ground since it was again just too hot. If you come to KL, I definitely recommend you to plan it in the cooler months so you can travel around easier. So next up is Singapore, and this was the last place we visited before we flew to Japan. We came here by bus because the connections for the train were very weird and it would just take a really long time. The bus we took from KL to here was I think one of the most comfortable bus rides I've ever been on. Even though Singapore itself is small, I feel like there's just so much to do and so much to see. One of my favorite places is Orchard Road. It's so fun to just walk down there and there's a bunch of stores you can check out. Another one is Marina Bay Sands, which is the famous building with the boat-like structure on top. Garden by the Bay is another beautiful place to visit, and it has a bunch of cool things inside. I'm not sure if it goes on for the entire year or if it's just a summer event, but I did see that they do these really beautiful light shows there. So we were personally not able to go because it was just really rainy when we went, but it might be a really fun experience. Another place to visit here would be the Old Town. Here you can find previous homes that they had in Singapore beautifully preserved, and it's such a nice little area to walk around in. You'll find a bunch of small souvenir shops as well as some really nice cafes and restaurants. So this part of the video will be about Korea and Japan. So first of all, Japan. This was a place that I was looking forward to visiting for a really long time. We actually didn't have any idea of what we were going to do in Japan. We booked the plane tickets when we were in Laos, and we just thought we would figure out the rest later. The first important thing to know about Japan is that they have their Shinkansen trains, which gets you from point A to point B in no time. This basically means you can take a day trip to a lot of the cities while staying in only one, and a lot of people use this to their advantage. So we did 5 days in Tokyo, 2 days in Hakone, 3 days in Osaka with some day trips, 2 days in Hiroshima, and 2 days in Fukuoka. So first up is Tokyo. So one of the problems we ran into in Tokyo was figuring out where we were going to book the hotel. This is such a spread out city, we wanted to be not in the city center, but also not too outside either. We also looked for a place that was somewhat quieter at night, but also relatively close to all the tourist attractions. We finally decided on Asakusa, and for us, we really loved the area. The hotel we picked was very small, and I'm assuming many hotels in the area are like this. It was very clean and very tidy. Asakusa was very calm, but also close to the Sensoji Temple and the famous Nakamisedori Street. I highly recommend the street, even though it's crowded. There are so many stalls with anything that you can think of, as well as a lot of small food buy options and a bunch of souvenir shops that sell very cool, quirky things. Another thing I can recommend is going to the Kappabashi Kitchen Street. It is full of shops that sell Japanese knives, fun kitchen utensils, chopsticks, ceramics, and literally everything else that you can think of that belong in the kitchen. We didn't have a lot of space, so we didn't get that much, but we did get some chopsticks and some chopstick holders from there at a much cheaper price than elsewhere. Tokyo Skytree was another highlight of the trip, and I definitely recommend going up to the top and going towards sunset because it is amazing to watch from there. Definitely book your tickets for this a couple of days in advance because it does get really busy, especially during the sunset times. So because Tokyo is so big, I'll sort of just divide the rest into districts. The first we went to is Shibuya, where you will find the Scramble Crossing. You will find a lot of people taking pictures there and also constantly crossing the street just to experience it, which was super funny to see. The area is always packed and buzzing, so I found it to be quite fun, but it is definitely overwhelming. Another place to visit is Ginza, where you will find a lot of the flagship stores of the most famous Japanese brands, such as Uniqlo, Muji, and Onitsuka Tiger. Akihabara is also another fun district. It has a lot of games, anime stuff, and arcade-like places. Okay, so second up is Hakone. I think this was my favorite Japanese city that we visited on the trip. It was so green and so beautiful. However, everything is quite far from each other, so I do think you would need a minimum of 2 days to cover everything there. A highlight here for me were the bus drivers. I don't think I've seen a bus driver drive that fast on a windy mountain road in my life. It was generally just one of the funniest experiences. Especially the way to the hotel when everyone was picked up from the main station and the bus was just so full to the point where everyone was packed in like sardines. So it was definitely an experience. We did a pirate boat trip along Lake Ashi and it's definitely a must-do. It was super cloudy when we went, but even like that we had a great time. And if the weather isn't cloudy, you're actually able to see Mount Fuji from there. Another great activity was going to the Hakone ropeway to Owakudani, which is a volcanic alley with active sulfur vents. Here you can also get an egg cooked in sulfur, which is known as kuro tamago, and the belief is that when you eat one of these eggs, it adds 7 years into your life. Finally, also go-to in Hakone would be the open air museum. It is such a beautiful place and I definitely recommend going and spending a couple of hours there. Inside, they have a separate part for the works of Picasso, which mostly consisted of his clay works. So third up is Osaka. So before we actually settled on Osaka, we were thinking if it's better to stay in Osaka or Kyoto, and we finally settled in Osaka because the hotels were just so much cheaper and better, and it was a very short way to Kyoto. Both of them are separate cities, however, you will see if you take the train between them that they're literally connected since the cities grew towards one another. So realistically, it doesn't really matter which one you stay in, and it just depends on more of your itinerary. I won't lie, Osaka didn't have too much to offer, but it was definitely still worth going. Also, I found that it was a little bit calmer than Kyoto, so we found it more comfortable to stay there. Here, again, there are so many temples to visit, for example, the Shitennoji Temple. We also visited the Osaka Castle, which was very crowded with a lot of tours. I think in Osaka, the main highlight is the Dotonbori district. It is so lively, there's so many bars and restaurants and clubs in that area. And I think there will be a perfect place to try some Japanese dishes such as takoyaki and okonomiyaki. So next up is Kyoto. The best time to go there, realistically, would be around April when they have the bloom of the cherry blossom trees, known as sakura. Even so, I think it's a beautiful city just to see and experience. So here is where they have the Fushimi Inari Taisha, which is the most famous shrine you see a lot of the time in Kyoto. The bamboo forest is also quite cool, and the area around it is such a nice neighborhood you can also visit and walk around. So now about Nara. Again, we went here on a day trip from Osaka. Nara is known for its deers that roam around the city on their own, and for me it was just one of the coolest experiences in Japan. I loved spending time with the deers. There's nothing really much else to see except for the deers, but it is very fun. Next up is Hiroshima. The most famous thing to see in Hiroshima is the A-bomb dome, which is the epicenter of where the nuclear bomb exploded, but it somehow left this building standing. You can also see the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, where you can see the effects of the nuclear bomb on the inhabitants of Hiroshima and Japan in whole. I found the museum to be really informative and a great way to learn and understand how the nuclear bomb affected Hiroshima and Japan. So now finally on to Fukuoka. So Fukuoka was our last stop on our journey through Japan. Fukuoka is a typical seaside town and I really enjoyed it. There is a huge underground shopping center which you have to see if you go, called the Tenjin Chikagai, and it's basically tunnels of shops underground. Another place you can go is the Fukuoka Tower, which is right by the Momochi Seaside Park, where you can go and sit by the beach as well. We didn't really do much else except one crazy event that happened when we got into a car accident about 2 minutes before we made it onto the ferry station. Thankfully, nothing happened to us, but it was definitely an experience right before we left Japan. So last stop is Korea. So Seoul was our last stop before we flew home. We took a ferry from Fukuoka to Busan, and then we stayed in Busan overnight since we didn't want to travel again and get to Seoul very late. In the morning, we took a bus into Seoul, which only took about 3 hours. I think the ferry was one of the funniest things on the trip. It's not a ferry where you have seats, and instead you have rooms with Japanese-style floor bedding. Essentially, you get a room with 8 other strangers. You pick a bed of your choice, you make your bed, and then you just lie down and chill basically until you get to Busan. There is also a game room where you have some claw machines and driving games, which was really fun. So Seoul was also nice, although I would say there definitely weren't a lot of touristy things you can do in the city. For us, it just felt more of like a big city, and a lot of tourists were actually there only to shop. There were similar attractions to the ones in Japan, for example, dressing up in national clothes and walking around the temples. However, we just didn't do those things because we already had done them in Japan. Korea is of course known for its beauty products, so I can really recommend skipping any small stores because they always have a higher price, and go directly to Olive Young, where you will find anything you want at good reasonable prices. So that was the end of our trip, and we flew back home after 80 days. So in total, we traveled around 21,495 kilometers. We visited 33 cities, took 25 trains, 6 buses, and 2 ferries. Sadly, the reason why this video took me so long to make was because about 5 days after we arrived in Valencia, we actually had a huge flooding, and it has just taken a while to get back to normal life from that. But I hope in the end this was very helpful in getting to know more about the trip and the countries that we visited. And thanks for staying until the end. Bye!